This May, more college graduates are entering into the workforce than at any year in American history, and most of them cannot find work.
It's likely to be one of the most challenging times in history for graduates to get a job today.
My main friend group graduated with great degrees from great schools. It's been 1.5 years since graduation. Not one of them has a job, not one.
I just feel so directionless. I feel like even though I studied engineering, that it's cooked, and I feel like I'm questioning my life decisions.
According to Fortune, this is the worst entry-level job market in 37 years. So what's going on? The answer is simple and it's twofold. The first is AI. A few months ago, I released a video where I did an in-depth breakdown about exactly how bad AI had become and how Deloitte, one of the largest consulting firms on the planet, was actively advising their clients to remove human jobs to replace them with AI. And since then, things are only getting worse because over the past few months, it's come out that places like JPMorgan and Chase or Goldman Sachs have started to develop their own AI clients, often in partnership with huge AI providers, to replace many of their analyst and associate roles. Now, without getting too into the weeds about the finance industry, what this ultimately means is that the roles that were previously considered the most prestigious roles you could get out of college, the jobs that would pay six figures the day you walk off a campus, and the roles that, at least in theory, required a level of technical expertise that would not be able to be replicated by someone just plugging stuff into ChatGPT, well, those roles are now being replaced. And if they can be replaced, well then literally every other role that any entry-level worker could hope to have, at least in theory, seems susceptible. So it's a little wonder why AI is actively hurting the entry-level job market. And the other thing that's going on is that the economy is not doing nearly as well as the Standard & Poor's 500 performance would indicate. Let me explain. So basically, every single major finance talking head will tell you that things are going well because they're looking at things from an investment standpoint.
After-tax real incomes for everyday Americans will be surging again. That, to me, is the key ingredient to Trumponomics.
Let's go back to what Sarah was talking about a few minutes ago about how strong the economy is. I'll go one step further and I'll say that the economy is actually booming.
The stock market has set 53 all-time record highs since the election. Think of that, 1 year.
But that can be very misleading for how things are actually going on the ground for people who are just trying to find work so they can hopefully start to invest. Because if we look at the market, at least in theory, if the market's going up, the economy is doing well, and jobs are being created. That's the narrative that we've been told. It's also importantly not true. Because if we take the biggest 500 companies in the United States and take away 7 of them, the magnificent 7 huge tech stocks that you know the name of off of the top of your head, if you were just to guess 7 large tech companies, well then what we'll see is that over the past 5 years, the actual stock market has been stagnant. And as a general rule, when companies are not growing, they're not expanding the workforce they have. So if a company currently has 5,000 employees and they're doing the same bottom line year to year to year, they're probably going to stay at around 5,000 employees. That just makes sense. The issue is, if they know they're going to have to bring in so many people at low levels on the ladder every year, in a growing economy, there's going to be more of those entry-level roles than there are recent grads taking them. And so people who are graduating college or high school have leverage to negotiate for the roles they want. In this market, though, that's no longer the case, because if we have years of graduates who are still just struggling to break into their industry, all competing for roles that are largely non-existent because either these companies are, at the best of cases, keeping their workforce the same or are often reducing it because of AI, well then there's all of this demand for roles and very little supply, meaning companies get all of the leverage. They can get 100 applicants for a role that will be filled by one person. And in that case, they're not taking someone with no work experience. They're not taking someone who a few years ago would have been an easy hire. Instead, they're taking someone with 3 years of work experience at a competitor. Because even if a role is supposedly entry level, if the market is bad enough where someone is willing to apply for an entry-level role despite having years of experience because maybe they just don't like their current company or their current boss, then why would someone say no to someone they can pay an entry-level salary to who has years of experience? They're not going to, which means that everyone struggling to get their initial experience is being left behind because they're not given the chance to get experience. And that's the second biggest reason why young people, simply put, cannot find work. Okay, so by now I hope you can tell that things aren't going great. The youth unemployment rate is only going to continue to rise in the near future if nothing changes. But before I break down the 4 big things this is doing to Gen Z collectively, I wanted to take a moment with no fancy effects to talk about the real of this with you. Because as I progress in this video, I implore you to remember, these are people's lives. The people I'm referring to are not some abstract number. They're real people. They might be your neighbor, or someone you went to school with, or maybe even one of your friends that just is trying to hide that they're going through this from you. Now, with that said, I want to break down the 4 big consequences of all of this, beginning with the first consequence, which is that 1 in 3 18 to 34-year-olds today live with their parents, predominantly because either they cannot find work, which means that they can't afford to rent a place, so they have to live with their parents to even be able to get by, or if they're among the lucky few, they could live on their own because they have some job, even if they're underemployed, but it makes more financial sense to live with their parents while they're earning a little bit of money so they can invest in the future. So functionally, people today either have to live with their parents and get behind because they don't have work, or they have to live with their parents, hopefully have some work so they can invest their money and try and get ahead, or they can try and go and rent in the most expensive rental market in American history while trying to also achieve all the early life milestones. Can you see a problem? I can, and that leads us into the second consequence, which is that all of this causes a financial death spiral.
New data shows Generation Z is having trouble keeping up.
Young people are facing a serious debt problem. Between 2022 and 2023, boomers saw a slight decrease in debt year over year, while Gen X saw a slight uptick. But millennials saw their average debt increase by 8%, and Gen Z more than 15%.
Nearly half of Gen Z runs out of money before the end of the month ends, and that's not just budgeting, that's just survival at that point.
Let me put it simply. Most young Americans today go to college. Now, we can say that that is up to the individual, and that is absolutely true. But that does not change the fact that most people go to college, and the vast majority of them will take on debt to do so. Now, if you graduate college, maybe you got an IT degree, you know how to code. That's the kind of degree that only a few years ago nearly guaranteed you a great job. And today, in all reality, it probably means that you are unemployed because an AI client can do your job for a fraction of the price. Now, if that is you, congratulations. Most likely, you took on student debt to go to university. And the problem is, you are now, if you took any private loans, and in many cases also public loans, having to pay down the interest on your debt while unemployed and unable to even afford groceries potentially, while also handling a debt burden. Seeing that, is it any surprise that the amount of debt that young people are in to just even afford groceries is rapidly skyrocketing? I don't think it is. And that naturally leads me into the third big consequence, which is that if people are starting their life behind, it takes them far longer to get to the major life milestones that they want to achieve. I mean, we don't have to look any further than seeing what the average age of a first-time homebuyer is today. Because as of today, the median age of a first-time homebuyer is 40 years old. Think about that. People used to try and buy a home in their mid-20s to start a family. Now they're having to wait a decade and a half longer. And every year, it seems, the median age only continues to rise, which shows us that people are unable to achieve the big milestones in life that have become synonymous with the American dream over time. And if people are delaying houses, they're also so too delaying families, with one of the largest reasons people report for not having kids yet being that they cannot afford it. And I think that represents a real tragedy, because what used to be the norm now feels like a luxury somehow. And so taking these three issues together, the fourth big consequence of rising youth unemployment is that it has an enormous toll on people's mental and emotional health. I've already covered on this channel how Gen Z is the loneliest generation in America today, but it's also been reported by Cigna that Gen Z is the most stressed generation of all time. And it's little wonder why that is. Imagine if this doesn't describe you graduating college with $50,000 to $100,000 in debt, being unable to find work for months, and then eventually you decide to take a job just doing DoorDash or working at Starbucks just to have some modicum of an income, but you still have to pay off your student debt. You're having to move back in with your parents to try and get by, and you're hoping that in the next few years, maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to finally put that degree to work and start to get the ball rolling on your life. But with every major headline brings the news that more and more jobs are going away because of AI or because of a weakening economy. Now, if that were you, how would you feel? Probably not great. And we know all of the evidence points to, as people become more stressed and less financially free, they become more and more isolated from those around them, creating a downward spiral that doesn't just hurt them financially, but can potentially undermine the entirety of their 20s, if not a greater point in their life, which is why we have to solve this. This isn't some theoretical issue that needs a solution because it's interesting. This is a crisis in our society that must be addressed. Because in the wealthiest country in the course of human history, the youth should not feel like they cannot even find work, and even if they do find work, that they are not going to be able to achieve a quality of life that was nearly guaranteed to those who came before them. Now, with that said, I do want to talk solutions, because I actually didn't make this channel just to complain. I want to fix these issues. And so first, I want to talk about what you as an individual, if you're going through any of this, can do to improve your own life. And then I want to talk about how society as a whole can try and move towards solving all of these problems. So with all this said, if you are currently struggling to find a great job and start your career, what can you do to avoid everything we've been talking about? Well, for myself, what I have chosen is a sales career. Now, the reason for that is, yes, there are AI clients that can do cold calls already for companies, but the most effective form of sales will always be person to person, or at least video to video, where I'm talking to you and trying to convince you to buy a product or service that I'm selling. And so if that remains the case, which it will, because human psychology will not change just as fast as AI will change, then that's an industry segment that at least has a lot more protection than anything else, which is why I personally chose sales and why I would recommend it to anyone who is still early in their career. Now, if I were someone just starting out in a sales career, what I would do from day one is try and break into technology sales. It's where money is going, and it gives you a huge potential opportunity to jump into software as a service sales a few years later, which is where you can make really great money working from home. So how do you break in if this is something you are interested in? I have an actual easy way for you to get started today, which is to use Course Careers Intro to Tech Sales. For those of you who don't know, Course Careers is an online site that specializes in helping people start their careers without any previous education required, and they know how to get people into technology sales. In fact, I found this testimonial video to be incredibly encouraging.
I don't work 80 hours a week no more. I make more. I make more from this one job than I was making with those two jobs combined before. right? And I have a whole lot more of my time back.
Now, if you're interested in getting into tech sales, use the link in the pinned comment below to access a completely free intro course into tech sales. And if you decide that you want to pursue this career, using my link will get you $50 off course careers. And with that said, it's time that we turn our attention to what we as a society could do to try and solve some of these problems. So the first policy we need to change is that we need to change how we track data. So right now, the current federal unemployment rate is only 4.2%, which is absurdly low given everything we've talked about in this video.
People who weren't looking for work under Biden's administration are getting out there and looking for work in the Trump administration. That's exactly what we want.
The Made Jobs report, 172,000. Is there any doubt that this anecdotal evidence about a good labor market has been very correct? That is a really strong number.
These numbers are much better than expected, Cheryl. The unemployment rate, 4.3%. More people are entering the workforce.
But the way the government got there is because they consider anyone even working a single hour a week as being employed, in the same way as someone working a 9 to 5 is considered employed. Meaning that if you drive DoorDash for even an hour a week just to help put money on the table while you're looking for your real next opportunity, you're considered employed. And that seems at the very least a little misleading, especially when we also consider if you haven't applied for a role recently, you're also not considered unemployed, which means that the millions of people who have actively just given up, completely given up on applying for new roles or applying for college because they've just become so overwhelmed by the state of the economy, well, those people also aren't considered unemployed, even though we think any reasonable person would consider them unemployed. So unemployment stats and other stats need to be tracked much more accurately. And this does matter because right now, if you turn on any mainstream outlet, they can tell you honestly to their audience of older Americans who have more influence in politics and in the economy, the unemployment rate is low. Things are going great, and it means there is an information disconnect. There's an information asymmetry between the people who are struggling and the people who have the ability to actually make a meaningful change if they're so inclined to do so, which is why accurate reporting of the data matters. So the second change we need to make is regarding student debt laws in America. Right now, we have millions of people who are in debt because they got a degree who are unable to find work. And this matters because people who have that debt have to pay, in many cases, hundreds, if not over $1,000 a month in minimum payments on their student loans, because if they fail to do so, their credit score is going to tank and they risk all of the negative consequences of not paying their debt back. But if you're currently struggling for months or even a year plus on end to find work, paying off student debt, well, that's a very vicious recipe. And look, this would be okay, at least in theory, if you could declare bankruptcy to get out of your debt.
You know, you can make all kinds of investments and you can discharge. If you can't pay back the loan, you can discharge it in bankruptcy. The one exception we make is student loans. And I ask whether that is wise national policy. People who borrow to invest in their education, that we do not forgive.
So yes, it should be on the consumer when they borrow something to pay back the money they owe, but this seems to be a little bit unfair when the course of action you have to fix an unbearable economic situation is not available to you. And so at the bare minimum, people should be able to at least not have to pay student debt when they are still looking for work after getting their degree. That's a bare minimum fix. And my third and final policy suggestion for this video is that we need the government to support people displaced by AI. Previously, when the coal industry collapsed, America's government stepped in to try and provide support to displaced workers. And offering some level of additional support to people who are struggling through no fault of their own, but because of macroeconomic conditions, is reasonable. Especially when you consider that all of the metrics that the government actually cares about, GDP growth, year-over-year stock market growth, and unemployment rate, are doing so well, which surely means the economy is doing well enough to support the people who are being hurt by the undercurrents of that economy. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll love this one next. Thanks and have a great day. Bye-bye.